Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a plenary, wonderful plenary by Kathryn Accurso, who's going to talk about anti-racist genre pedagogy. Kathryn is an associate professor of teaching multilingual learners in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia. Her work focuses on preparing K-12 educators to support multilingual learners' engagement, growth, critical thinking, and well-being. She engages anti-racist approaches to disciplinary literacies, SFL and genre pedagogy, and action research as a tool for professional development that helps teachers support diverse learners in engaging with acquiring, critiquing, and reimagining knowledge and language across the subjects. With focus on anti-racist genre pedagogy, reimagining SFL practice through critical race cross-pollination, Kathryn will lead the plenary this morning. Kathryn, welcome, and floor is yours.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. And thank you for that introduction, Ani. And thank you so much to Vin and Thomas and Eric and others who are involved in just putting this event together and doing their best to keep it free and accessible to folks who are all around the world. What a wonderful group to have here with me this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I know it's been a lot of hard work and a labor of love. So great to have this opportunity. Thank you. So I am joining you today, as I said, from the afternoon rather than the morning in Vancouver, Canada, where I'm a settler scholar on unceded Musqueam territory. And so I'm fortunate to live and work very nearby to the Musqueam Reserve and Community Center, which is one place that Hunkaminam language revitalization work is happening. So as part of a land acknowledgement, I thought for this group, a language acknowledgement might be really appropriate too. And so on this land, because of the work of students like Cheyenne, who you see in the picture here, I know to say Aitswale, or kind of good day, as you see in the middle picture there, or Haitsepka. Thank you all for having me today. So this is a picture of the beautiful coastline here, and I hope that you'll have a chance to visit someday. Now, I want to try something as we're getting started here because I'm among SFLers. At a NASFLA meeting one time, that's the North American SFL group, someone joked, okay, field, tenor, and mode, which one are you? If you were one of these dimensions, which one are you and why? And so I want to try this with you all this morning just to see if it kind of holds up as a get to know you activity. Who do we have in the room here today? If you were field, tenor, or mode, which one do you identify primarily with? I know they all work together. I know they don't describe people, but I find SFLers kind of gravitate towards one. So think about it, but don't overthink it. Put it in the chat. I'm so curious. Which one are you, field, tenor, or mode? Are you an ideas person, more of a people person? Let's see who's here. Now me, I think I'm a connector. And so I see connections between people, ideas, this kind of thing. And so I think maybe I'm mode. Maybe that's my kind of front dimension. And actually connections between theories is something that we're going to be talking about today. So let's see who else is here. We've got, field first, field. Annabelle's here, another mode, textual function for me. Lucy, maybe mode. All right, we have a little bit of tenor in the house. This is great. It's kind of such a funny, nerdy way to kind of see people in a room. I love it. It gives me kind of a cool sense of who's here. And we've got all the dimensions represented. So thank you for playing along. Now getting into our topic for the next hour, critical race theory, racism, anti-racism, and what any of that has to do with SFL. I think there are a few other things that I want to share about where I'm coming from besides the fact that I identify with mode, right? So I've actually really enjoyed some of the bits of past SFLIG or SFLIG plenaries where we just get to hear a little bit actually about how different folks kind of came into the SFL community, because I think it's in part communities that are so important in terms of who we feel accountable to in our work. And so I want to say a little bit about how I came to SFL, but I'm also going to go just a little bit further back than that too, as I'm bringing us in to these topics today. So you know that I'm in Vancouver now, but I didn't grow up in Vancouver or in Canada. I'm actually from St. Louis, Missouri, which is right about in the middle of the United States. And it's at the confluence of these two big rivers. And both in the past and all the way up through my childhood there in the Midwestern US, St. Louis is a place that has some very complicated race relations because this city and its position right along those rivers means that it carries a pretty big history being a major trading center during the height of enslavement. And sometimes even still to this day, it's cited as one of the most racially segregated cities in the US in terms of Black and white neighborhoods and schools. And so for me, coming up in this area, I came up in the 80s and 90s as part of school desegregation efforts. And so I attended schools that were majority Black and immigrant. And St. Louis is a city that's also attracted a lot of immigration through industrial job expansion, like a lot of cities around that time. And so, coming from that position, then I went on to become an English teacher in Missouri, on the east coast of the US, then in Kenya. And if you add to this picture that my mom was born and raised in West Africa, and I've had grandparents who were only a generation away from their kind of Dutch and German immigration, this picture, and all of this is to say that growing up in that context at that time, I've been steeped in discourses about race and language and power because of these confluence of factors from a young age. So kind of growing up into being an English teacher, an applied linguist, a parent, a member of different diverse communities, you can kind of see that in the story on this slide. And so this is the background that's coming with me to the SFL community. And maybe you're wondering, how did any of that lead you here? Along this path, I was working at the Center for Applied Linguistics while I was still teaching. And our team at that time had some questions about academic writing, and especially K-12 multilingual learners, and the term genre was in the air. And so I wanted to dig into that a little bit more. And that's when I began my PhD studies about 15 years ago. And that was with Meg Gebhardt, whose work I'm sure many of you know. She's just so committed actually to pursuing equity goals through applied linguistics and just really rigorous teacher professional development. And so she is my connection to SFL as this very big theory of language. And especially in the context of schooling in North America, how SFL can inform the ways that we work with multilingual learners to kind of get a grip on some unfair expectations about academic language in the fact that those expectations are implicit or untaught and kind of serve as gatekeepers. And so during the PhD, I was focused mostly on math and science and teaching the language of math and science using genre pedagogy, especially with high school teachers at that time, to understand what are the literacy practices that make up participating in math and science, and how can we teach them rather than kind of putting them forward as these unnamed expectations. And it was during that work, during the PhD, I met a student who asked to be called Alberta. So she was grade 11 at the time, taking an ELL or an English learner version of chemistry when we met. And she was also in an English supported version of math, and she was doing great in both. And actually, this picture is not Alberta for privacy reasons. That's a newspaper photo from the same science classroom. But one day, the real Alberta came in from another course, and she was pretty frustrated. And we were talking about how her school views multilingual learners. And she said, well, honestly, some people think we're stupid. There's students and some other racist teachers who are like, they don't know English, they can't do that. And then the longer version of the quote, she goes on to say, like, students who know English might get it or not, but we can do this, just give us a try. And so, these words really sat with me because we can see that it's not just a problem about language or about making expectations clear or building the English repertoire. And, this Alberta came to my mind just the other day when I was listening to a poet read from his new collection. So it's one of my UBC colleagues in creative writing, who's also an Oxford scholar. And he speaks a lot about his experience of growing up as an Indigenous child in rural Alberta, Canada, not Alberta, right? And he has this beautiful line in his collection. He says, all children come from the same country of dreaming. And I thought immediately of the other Alberta, the student, because her dream was to pursue a career in medicine, but her dreams were kind of colliding with these ideologies embedded in schooling. And that's the tension that is at the heart of this conversation today. Because Alberta, the student, wasn't really struggling with chemistry or math or English. She was struggling with a system that viewed her through a racist deficit lens. And, I introduced you to Alberta, but of course, it's not just about one student or at one school. It's about the ways that racist and colonial ideologies are shaping what counts as legitimate knowledge and who gets to belong and how, even linguistically, right? So stories like Alberta's are kind of showing us what's at stake. And, in this talk and in my own work, I think words and experiences like Alberta's really challenge us not to look away from these dimensions of the experience, but to really come back to what does it mean to be accountable to communities that are experiencing harm in spaces where we work. So that made me think about Halliday and his writing about socially accountable linguistics. And if we're going to use linguistics to tackle complex issues, how we're going to also have to do that by reaching across disciplinary boundaries. And so just looping back to my story, in addition to working with Meg, who you see in the middle of the picture there, as a PhD student, some of the folks that cross-pollinated my thinking, even at that time, were on the screen behind me, Jonathan Rosa, who is now quite well known for his work in ratiolinguistics, but it's sort of just germinating then. And on the right side, Betsy McEnany, who's a keen sociologist, and she was a former math teacher as well. And so this journey has really included inspiration from multiple disciplines. And as you'll hear later, it grows to include legal scholars and more. And so now that I've brought you into my world just a little bit, I think here's where I hope we can head together today. We can build from those first stories towards a systems sense of things, moving from lived experiences into the theory. And then I wanted to spend a little time exploring how SFL and critical race theory can work together, at least to my thinking. And I'll talk a little bit about what we've learned from some empirical work so far and some insights we have for going forward in this work. Okay, so to understand why reimagining SFL matters, I think we need to see first how racism, in the way that Alberta described it, is actually operating systemically. Because I think it can be very easy to hear one story like Alberta's or others and think of it almost as an exception. But I want to listen to a few more voices here to just expand out into a patterned sense of things. For instance, we could hear the words of another SFLer and one of my very strong thinking and writing partners in much of this work, Dr. Jason Mizell. He identifies as the parent of an Afro-Ecuadorian kid shown in this picture, who's also a multilingual learner. And from his perspective as a parent, he would see assignment after assignment come home, really diminishing community knowledges. And he's talked really openly, even with some folks in this room, right, about the generational buildup of that experience. Watching his mother's knowledges be very subjugated, and then experiencing racism through schooling himself, and then becoming a parent where he started to seriously wonder, like, will my kid ever bring home a text where community knowledges are reflected and presented as valid? And not just like in contrast to whiteness, because for him, that was all about whether or not his child was going to be accepted in schooled spaces for who he was and how he speaks and what he knows. And in the words of his kid, Dylan, who was in grade 6 at the time and is in college now, Dylan expressed being really left wanting by that approach to schooling, wishing that he was reflected in what was presented as legitimate knowledge in his classroom. He said, I just want to see us in my school when I have to read. We could also, here in Canada, listen to a recently passed elder. This is one of Canada's first Indigenous judges, Murray Sinclair, who wrote that while he and others succeeded in schooling, it wasn't without cost to his humanity and sense of self-respect, and kind of expands this out to like a full-on legacy that we're dealing with if we're dealing through school, whether for justice or not. And he really flags for us clearly that cost of being in a system with racist and colonial origins. And so, we're getting this idea of academic success being in tension with some kinds of loss. And that's a tension that our pre-service teachers hold as well. So here we can see that theme in a reflection from a pre-service teacher who was a former English learner herself. We call her Kala Crown in the research, but she says, I have this big issue with academic language because it feels like it's not a fair game. On the one hand, we want to teach standard English so students can succeed in the game. But on the other hand, how do we acknowledge that it seems like a racist and moving target that we never totally get clear boundaries around? And anyway, acceptance of the language is biased towards students based on their racialized identities too. Or if that's not enough, we could even go back to our poet who came from the country of dreaming, right? He also wrote that encounters in schooling sort of made him destroy what he didn't want stolen, meaning cultural and linguistic knowledge, his Cree self. And many of us know or we're working with communities that are putting a lot of time and effort into reclaiming or revitalizing aspects of language and culture that weren't supported or were maybe even severed in schooling. And so an important starting point, and I say this because it's a question I've gotten a lot in the work, is understanding that the issue of racism is not just individual. White supremacy, English supremacy, the ways these ideologies are fully embedded in school and society is a systems thing, right? And these examples show some ways that ideologies are touching learners, teachers, parents, families, communities. And so if we take these experiences seriously, this is where we get to the question of today's talk, which is how then can we take a more focused, concerted, explicitly anti-racist go at SFL pedagogy? Or at least that's the question it led me to. Now, before I go on to talk a little bit about anti-racist genre pedagogy, the way that Jason and I started to experiment with conceptualizing it, I just want to say that this is one of many possible pathways. It's not, I don't mean to present it at all as the answer to these very big problems. There are a lot of valid ways that colleagues are approaching this work. And I know that some are engaged in these very nuanced theoretical debates. Some are working in the praxis side of things with curriculum. I know folks, even on the SFLIG listserv, are exploring how individuation matters or register versus enregisterment and more. And I'm not going to get deeply into those details now, but we can talk about them later during discussion if folks are interested. And what we are going to get into today, what I do want to talk about is how we're trying to hold two theories together that are very good at systems thinking. Of course, systemic functional linguistics, but the other being critical race theory. And again, just to acknowledge that this conversation about combining frameworks was something that really gained some steam in partnership with Dr. Meisel, who you saw in that picture a moment ago with his son. And though he isn't able to be here today, he's certainly in the framework and the research that I'm going to present around it. So let's talk a little bit here about the concepts. I think many of us have this sense that SFL has great potential to be used for social good, right? It's what brings a lot of us, attracts us to the theory in some sense. But in classrooms, one of the most incredible efforts, I think, has been the development of genre pedagogy. So in keeping with that systems theme, this approach, it's one where students are systematically scaffolded to notice, to name, and to practice using what Highland talks about as discursive resources of power, disciplinary language, diagrams, images, equations, etc. And in my work with multilingual learners, it's partially countering the idea that they can't engage in rigorous intellectual disciplinary work until they so-called have language, right? Genre pedagogy, it really helps us with that concept of learning language while learning through language and learning about language. And though, I understand we might hear some critiques of the available evidence for genre pedagogy, even during this conference, any of us who have worked in classrooms can point to examples of how the approach supports designated English learners and other students in classrooms. And so that's genre pedagogy. But there can be a perception amongst some scholars who really take a strong social justice and language teaching focus that SFL is mainly descriptive and even prescriptive, and it's not very sensitized to ideology. And so maybe it's not the best tool for doing justice work. But I would argue that the theory really does attempt to account for ideology, as would many others in this room I know right now. Although it might not be the most talked about component of understanding or teaching text in context. And that's true even among our North American SFL group. Lots of folks within that community are thinking about and talking about and teaching from some pretty deep equity commitments for decades, right? But if you look closely at the writing that's tracked along the decades, it doesn't always reflect these conversations. Back in 2020, actually, with so much of our North American SFL work being in teacher education, we looked back at what our last 20 years of publications in that area had been, and we found that it was quite few of us, just 15 out of 147 authors that were explicitly talking about racism or racist ideologies as factors that influence language practices in schools. And, that's not really reflective of the wider conversations that were happening, but it was kind of an important reminder to us of, whoa, what are we talking about and what are we talking about? And so, here I wanted to look back into some of the key writings in the theory to see what kind of threads might help us surface that theme, and to see what threads we can pull on in trying to understand and shift racist ideologies that are influencing language and schooling and students and parents and families' experiences of that. So I'm going to draw some inspiration to a scholar in the room today. I found Annabelle Lucan's work to be very wonderful in the area of exploring ideology and SFL, and really appreciated the directions you're taking it as you shared in the plenary yesterday. The way that you've traced, for example, how Halliday's thinking was influenced by sociology, and this idea was really intriguing to me, that individual consciousness is historically contingent. And when I first read that concept as influencing Halliday's thinking, I wanted to let it sink in for a minute. Individual consciousness is historically contingent. And, this idea is clear in Halliday's work where he says ideology is part of context. If you think about it this way, human life is not separable from ideology, and language can't transcend it either. So in this 2017 piece, I also thought it was really interesting to just hold that up against another popular line of thinking in linguistics, the idea that humans can possibly have some kind of pure linguistic experience where they're directly accessing the world in a way that's not ideologically inflected. But I think on this idea, Halliday's pretty clear that that's not how he's understanding sociology or linguistics. There's no way to escape the ideology. She writes, language is always agentive for Halliday in the construction of reality, and by extension is always ideological. And if we try to set that aside, Halliday suggests we can't really ask serious questions, let alone imaginatively pursue them. And that's what we're trying to do here. And so ideology is in the theory. And I think, if you follow it into Hassan's work developing this, I think it's fascinating to see how she theorizes the relationship between ideology, system, and instance. And, back to the listserv conversation that's been happening around instance and instantiation and anti-racist possibilities, maybe Hassan's work could be really helpful in that discussion too. But she theorized that social structure is the wellspring of ideology, and so part of context of culture, but that ideologies manifest by being instantiated. Cultures or communities adopt or privilege some kind of semantic configuration rather than another, and so registers aren't themselves ideologies, but they're environments where ideologies manifest, period. And I think, it's important to pause here and just note that ideologies aren't inherently positive or negative, but it is taken as a fact of living with and through language in SFL that ideology is present. And so because there's a reciprocal relationship then between instance and system, she argues that semantic variety or diversity of meanings are key to shifting ideology in both situation and culture. Now, another point that I think is important to surface, and I appreciated in her work, is that ideology is not always easy to see. That the intricacy of language and of text itself, not just as like a thing, a text, but as an ecological environment, can make ideology difficult to see. The intricacy of texts is part of ideology's invisibility. Again, beautiful wording from Dr. Lucan here, summarizing Hassan's stance. And so if we acknowledge that texts aren't just individual choices, but part of semo history, Halliday encourages us to name our ideological antecedents because context matters, right? Our consciousness is historically contingent. The ways we teach language now and what languages are valued is really pretty deeply influenced by racist and colonial histories and ideologies and logics, and we see them play out in lived experiences like Alberta's and some others I quoted here. If we go back to the poet, he puts it starkly, history lays itself bare, but no one is looking. The evidence of ideologies is in plain sight, in texts, in curricula, in lived experience. And so we just want to train our attention there, if that's the case. Because I think that if we want to do what Hassan talks about, to think about how our work as language educators might participate in creating or maintaining or changing ideologies, and my interest is specifically around white supremacy and English supremacy, we need a way of looking at these things. And so that's where I think critical race theory can come in, because it's a line of scholarship that's really traced racial ideologies, at least in the contexts where I work. So critical race theory, this first emerged within legal studies, but it's now been really well developed within education as well. And I draw on this trajectory because it kind of provides theoretical receipts or just really thorough documentation of how unexceptional racism is in schools. It lets us know through deep documentation that this is the water we swim in if we're working in formal schooling contexts in North America. And of course, we know from the opening quotes as well, and a lot of scholarship, that racist logics are just thoroughly woven into there, birthed by colonial logics that are at play around the world. And maybe that's something else we can talk about more in the Q&A if folks are thinking about global inflections of what anti-racist genre pedagogy might look like. But CRT, critical race theory, also offers us a really clear sense of intersectionality, meaning that racial ideologies aren't the only ones structuring experiences of domination in schools. They intersect with social class, gender, ability, language, to arise different experiences of racism. As well, the third point there is that if texts capture human experience, as SFL suggests, CRT can call our attention to something written about as the voice of color. And so the idea here is that Black, Indigenous, other folks of color have perspectives on race and racism that white folks are unlikely to know in the same lived experience, and have a distinct voice about those ideas and experiences. And I want to take care here in introducing this topic to say that this is not some kind of unified voice. There's so much diversity across and within groups, but that the concept as teachers leads us to the sense that our texts have to represent a greater variety of identities. And we can consciously be including the voice of color, understanding, of course, that identities are implicated in authors' meaning-making choices. Now, pedagogically speaking, we traced SFL to genre pedagogy. Here you could trace a powerful pedagogy that's grown out of CRT, that's culturally sustaining pedagogy. And this work focuses on teaching in ways that keep students' languages and cultures alive, not just kind of from a tolerance sort of stance, but actively valuing and growing them. And it's kind of quite deeper than like a multiculturalism is beautiful ethic, although it is. But the argument of culturally sustaining pedagogy is that the world we live in now requires a kind of flexibility that's just not possible, or is extremely difficult to cultivate with a monovision in curriculum and instruction. And I do want to say, actually, that there's a really good amount of North American work that's combining culturally sustaining pedagogy with SFL. For example, Ruth Harmon's work, Jason Mizell, Francis, Luciana, Sabrina, Nicole King. And in fact, Christian just sent around the table of contents from a new special issue. Maybe some of you saw the Journal of Research and Applied Linguistics. And there's a paper in there by Soonja Chang and Kan Bui and Ruth Harmon about culturally sustaining pedagogy in math education with SFL. So if that's your space, I'll encourage you to check it out. But I will say something for me that seems missing in focusing on culturally sustaining pedagogy is that challenge to constantly be explicit about anti-racist aims. We sort of saw what happened with work in multiculturalism, and there's a way in which it gives a path for not saying what it is we're trying to challenge, change, or work against. And so our colleagues applying critical race theory in world language education, for example, are consistently challenging us to do more naming, to name the harms, name the communities being harmed, name the ideologies or oppressive logics that we're trying to work against. And here's one scholar who's challenging us in this area, Uju Anya, who was in dialogue with Jason and I about anti-racism and SFL. And she said, it's great that you're talking about racism and anti-racism now, but how far can you get if you don't explicitly name white supremacy as the thing you're trying to work against? And this makes a lot of sense to me because we're in a community that generally, I think, really sees the value of naming and tracing. And this idea was also echoed recently by Tasha Austin, who is at the University of Buffalo. She's another scholar who uses critical race theory in language education. And she suggests that if we want to affirm humanity and uphold the value of communities whose language practices have been kind of pushed to the margins or even severed by schooling, that we have to overtly name anti-Blackness and other forms of injustice. Because the naming of harmful practices is an important point of departure towards change that lasts. And that's what we want, is change that lasts. So I'm interested in that encouragement from scholars working in CRT. So if we want to keep racism and white supremacy and so on in a real sharp focus and in the conversation in our SFL work, it's something I think we can kind of know better and do better about. And so Jason and I started to think about if we're going to take seriously these topics, scholarship from CRT, this encouragement from colleagues in language education, but outside SFL, we were thinking about what could we bring to genre pedagogy, having great belief in the power of that approach, because it already does do a really beautiful job of scaffolding students to notice and name how texts work at various levels. But we thought, here's 5 things that we could adjust or change or add to genre pedagogy if we're inspired by principles from critical race theory. And so the first being that we have to pay attention to text selection, what texts we're teaching, and we should consider teaching community countertexts or texts that are written by minoritized authors that capture perspectives missing from a dominating school curriculum. And so be intentional about text selection. 2, we wanted to find ways to pay more explicit attention to ideology. 3, we noticed that that might involve an increased focus on interpersonal meanings in terms of role construction and relationships to knowledge and expertise. And then 4th, we thought about the genre aspect of genre pedagogy and what it might look like to remix genres or literally write ways into new patterns in terms of what language and knowledge is valued in the classroom. And that, of course, because assessment is such a pressing concern that we might have to think about what is valued in assessment as well. Shifting the kind of measuring stick to being from production of an accepted dominating form to valuing flexibility and remix and students' ability to kind of articulate the social effects of different choices. So we also, looked at rather one of the most loved representations of genre pedagogy, which is the teaching and learning cycle, the TLC. And whether you roll with kind of that Rothery version that's almost at its 30th anniversary, or the expanded version that Meg Gebhardt put forward, or one of the many others, we love the teaching and learning cycle. And so we thought about what might it look like to put the principles I just showed you into a genre-based teaching and learning cycle. And so in practice, which is a lot of what we do, how do we not just have theoretical rigor, but how do we move it into practice? We thought about countertext selection, maybe as part of planning, teaching explicitly about authors in the next stage, exploring what it might look like to share knowledge in new ways or remixing as the cycle progresses and so on, keeping that kind of gradual release of responsibility, valuing student experimentation and so on. We also put a circle around the outside, a reflective stance circle. And this is kind of a mechanism for us to keep ideology visible. Hassan mentioned that when we get down into the weeds of a text, the complexity can almost render ideology invisible. Well, this outer circle is a reminder for us that it's a practice to keep it in our thinking. So that ongoing process of learning and unlearning that we have to do as educators was kind of, we supposed, going to be a necessary ongoing part of anti-racist SFL practice. Okay, now that's the landscape. How are we doing, folks? You're with me still? Wonderful. Now I want to take you into a little bit of empirical work. So I want to share some of the things that we've learned so far from bringing these ideas to teachers. Now, I work in a very large teacher education program here in Canada. We enroll about 750 teacher candidates each year, half elementary, that's K to 7 grades, half secondary. And they all come in with a bachelor's degree, and then they move through our program in 11 months. And in that time, they take about 20 courses, and 4 of them have to do with language and literacy education. And so that's the space where we thought we can try to move some of these ideas into teacher training. And that was really possible and prioritized by my wonderful colleague, Margaret Early, who had already done a lot of work to ensure that genre approaches were embedded in the program, drawing on Pauline Gibbons' textbook, for example. And our department had the good fortune to be supported in that work by Jeff Williams, who was a former student of Hassan's and also a really beloved department head here for several years before my time. But there was already some acceptance of genre-based approaches in the program. And so when I came in 2020, and Jason and I published this framework that I showed you later that year, and we started asking outright the question, is academic language racist, and what do we do about it? Margaret said, we've got to try to incorporate this CRT-based version of genre pedagogy. And so we began working with pre-service elementary teachers at first to see how we could explain these ideas in ways that might help them get a grip on teaching practices that don't take for granted what Halliday called semohistory, teaching practices that acknowledge, like Hassan urged, that what arrives in school as legitimate text is not happenstance, but that there's options for ideological enactment that we can agentively shift. And so we started by looking at how just one subset of our teacher candidates responded to the ideas and what anti-racist genre pedagogy is trying to do. And looking at things like free write data and in-class activities, their choices of texts and so on, what we learned was what kinds of ideologies elementary teachers were noticing as they engaged with this framework. Were there ones that they noticed, ones that they challenged, ones that they reproduced? And we can see some of the overarching patterns here. So just broadly speaking, about half of the class started to pay attention to racialized dimensions of curriculum. Where they weren't doing it before, they started looking into authors' identities, seeking out marginalized perspectives on curriculum topics that weren't included in their curriculum already. And about half started to play with how they described genres' purposes, the purpose of different text types. For example, taking kind of a special focus on expanding what narratives are for. That came up quite a lot in this group. For example, they might choose an Indigenous authored story and identify its purpose as to inform, but not because they were mixing up traditional genre patterns, but because they were explaining they wanted to recognize non-dominant ways of passing knowledge. And so, whether or not they're getting the details of genre structure right, we could see them playing with purpose and dominant purpose and text type, that kind of thing. Now, on the other hand, there was a good deal of hesitation in naming race or racism or anti-racism as a dimension of curriculum design. Quite a number preferred to just talk about anti-racist work as bringing in different perspectives. And, to the last point that's on this slide here, we did see that in 80-something different texts that these students chose to use in elementary classrooms, only one of them was by a Black author, and ultimately that text was rejected as being too American, although we did notice that no similar critique was made or rejection either when it came to texts by white Americans or Indigenous peoples on US occupied lands. And so, in a small way, we saw the result being Black voices being rationalized out of the curriculum within this space. But that was our first try. It was just in the context of coursework. And, that study didn't really let us see how these ideas travel into actual classroom practice. And so our next study followed up with a smaller number of those participants after they'd been out in classrooms and responsible for teaching. And here we really wanted to see what, if anything, stuck. And so we looked at focus group transcripts, and they helped us see kind of how students were using any anti-racist principles or practices in their instruction and why or why not, and how they were positioning themselves relative to anti-oppressive work more broadly speaking. And so being, more than 6 months after they had completed our course time together, they were introduced to these ideas. One thing that was really interesting was hearing them speak back to factors that mediated their engagement in the first place with anti-racism, with genre pedagogy. And in terms of SFL and the genre theory part, there was, some curiosity about its relevance for elementary school. Like, why does linguistic theory matter for elementary school students or teachers? And in terms of CRT, they wondered, are we allowed to even use this? There's like a sense of danger to it. So a little sense that going into language territory is daunting, going into race territory is dangerous, and will either of those things pay off in terms of becoming a teacher? But what each of these participants explained is that despite these worries, there was really some nuanced percolation going on there. And so I'll give you the good news first, I suppose. All of them decided that after they had been in the classroom, they felt more strongly that anti-racist work was necessary. And this had to do, as we could see, with their sense that they actually had, at least in the Canadian context, quite a bit more autonomy than they thought they would when they began their program. So they saw that they could choose texts, they could center marginalized perspectives, they could teach for justice if they chose to do that. But despite all of them saying they had a stronger sense that this was going to be really important, most of them also said that they didn't do that. They didn't teach with countertext during practicum, and not because they didn't want to, but a host of other things, time pressure, what they thought were curriculum constraints, kind of a sense of being really new and where do I start, that kind of thing. And that was so interesting because they also described practices that sounded like they were teaching with countertext, you know, actively seeking out texts by Indigenous or transgender authors, for example. But they didn't want to name this work as being anti-racist. You know, we could see still a hesitancy there and kind of a passive anti-racism. And I put that label on it not at all to critique these new teachers, but just to observe that that naming piece can feel really perilous. And that came out in the data. We also saw that that silence, though, that hesitation was really textured. For some of our teacher candidates of color, we heard it was more about anticipating bias. You know, they were worried about the potential for their supervising teacher to see their anti-racist decisions as kind of deviations from a norm that might cost them a positive evaluation, or even that it might be looked at like as a kind of self-centering. For example, one student said, I'm South Asian. I have a few South Asian students, but not lots of them. So will it look like I'm making the curriculum all about me if I bring in South Asian authors, as opposed to just teaching material that has valuable learning potential, right? But on the other hand, some of our white teacher candidates tended to kind of be doing those discourse gymnastics. I think I like to think of them as like working really hard not to name racism or their positionality relative to it. And so, you know, kind of also important here to the last point on the slide, whatever their racialized background, is that teacher candidates who are talking about anti-racist praxis, even if they weren't naming it that outright, it was almost always something that they linked to content teaching, not so much to language teaching. So even those that were embracing countertext, they didn't kind of make that leap to thinking about how can I work with the language in that text. Some thought language analysis was not age appropriate. Some thought it would derail their classroom pacing, this kind of stuff. And so the next version of work that we did was really thinking about how we can get more coordinated in showing teacher candidates what it looks like to hold these priorities together: content, language, anti-racism, and just understanding some of their concerns from the previous work. The next iteration really focused in on lesson planning and working with a larger group of teacher candidates. So this study was really focused on what does it look like in curriculum to hold multiple priorities together, and how can we describe what it looks like to do it well and cohesively. And so ultimately, we found two dimensions that really distinguished lesson plans that seemed to be doing a good job, of course, albeit a novice job, holding anti-racist language and content instruction together in a lesson plan. And I'm going to show these two dimensions to you along a continuum, although I'm just going to unpack one box because there's a lot of text on this slide here. One dimension was something that we came to call critical disciplinary consciousness, meaning like they had a sense that disciplinary decision-making was connected to things like bias or power or privilege, equity, inequity. And the second dimension of strong integrated lesson plans was contextualized language supports. And so I want to say every teacher candidate who wrote a lesson plan did make disciplinary decisions, and they did include language supports. But these were kind of the clear buckets about the qualities of how they did those things that reflected stronger understandings of equity or agency in all of this. And so if we just look at the far right box there, the darkest blue one, we see that there was more intentionality around countertexts and the voice of color as teacher candidates kind of got it. And they accepted the teaching and learning potential of those texts, and they used them to teach reading comprehension in this case. And likewise, they also were the most likely to use students' multilingualism as a resource for learning. So these were the lesson plans that by and far drew on that resource and designed specific scaffolds to student profiles. And so, if we just look at those percents that are along the line here, from kind of less criticality on the left side and more integration of priorities at the right side, it's encouraging still that, this approach helped us kind of see criticality grow in a decent proportion of students. Now, that said, it was still easier for teachers to connect criticality with content decisions than with language. Criticality and language teaching and learning that's a lot to hold together, we find, for teacher candidates. It definitely remains a challenge in the work. And as well, one other thing we started to really struggle with at this stage was how do we handle productive constraint? And by this, I mean that this group, we had 122 teacher candidates in this particular study. They were taught by 3 different instructors. And 2 instructors said, text selection is open. Here's what we think about power and inequity and text selection. And they talked about countertexts and et cetera. But they said, it's up to you what text you choose to teach with. And one instructor said, we know you're taking a class on Indigenous children's literature and finding quality literature, and I want you to choose one of those texts to base your lesson plan on. And that choice of text really turned out to matter. A high quality text with equity potential was the basis of all the strongest lesson plans. And when teacher candidates were required to choose texts by diverse authors, they did, and they were more likely to end up with a stronger lesson plan. Ideally, teacher candidates will do this on their own, but what we saw was that when left to their own choice, only about 1/3 of students took up that invitation to bring authors of color into their classroom space. And so, something we're still really wondering and grappling with is, what do we require? What do we leave open? Can teacher candidates or teachers in general practice their way into a more critical consciousness, or do they need that before they can engage really in an anti-racist praxis? So how much do we dictate? How much do we leave open? We're not sure, but we're still wrestling with that. And just noting time, I'm going to just move forward 2 slides to share what we're up to now. We've taken some lessons from that early work, and some of the next areas we're trying to experiment in and learn from is based on that continuum work. Some partnerships with those who are teaching Indigenous education courses. Is there a way that we can accomplish goals by braiding together that priority as well? Or in the middle box there, the black box, you see, one of our challenges was keeping attention to language as part of this whole landscape. And so we've thought about what might it look like to not have a separate class about language, but have it fully embedded in a disciplinary methods class. And we're piloting some new genre-based assignments, but within a disciplinary methods class instead of a language education class, to see if that helps that priority stay at the foreground. And then lastly, even as we speak, this week, several other members of our team are trying to take their first go around at what it looks like to do any of this work with secondary teacher candidates. So disciplines like science, math, drama, arts, social studies, the whole gamut. And what can we learn from their take up or resistance as well? And so, more to come on these efforts, and I'll look forward to sharing learnings or, perhaps even course corrections from these as they come. So if we're going to take away some implications, I would say we can look broadly at, what we've seen that's promising in anti-racist genre pedagogy is that it does seem to be helping our new teachers call attention to power and equity in disciplinary decisions. It is supporting some anti-racist dispositions. It's encouraging deeper engagement with diverse voices for learning. And on the whole, it is supporting intentional curriculum design that foregrounds equity and maintains some contextualized language support. But we also have significant hesitations among teachers that we're going to have to continue to work with. And I think it's in part because of the sheer size of these systems, right? It's a big ask to develop racial literacy, and it's a big ask to develop the right amount of genre knowledge. And I think, both Sally and Maria highlighted that in their talks on day 1 of this conference. And there's institutional dynamics that they add up to deeply sedimented language practices that can make it feel like we need to do a big, deep dive in order to raise some of these ideological components to consciousness. And I think Annabelle's talk yesterday kind of made me think of that. Now I will say one of the more remarkable things I've been seeing in informal feedback from our teacher candidates is something that I wasn't expecting, which is their comfort talking about race and racism, at least within university spaces, is coming along faster than their comfort talking about language. And, maybe I should have expected that, but I didn't, and it's what I'm seeing. And so I'm thinking about how to keep trying to make language visible and talk aboutable with our teacher candidates in this whole enterprise. On that third point on this slide, I'll also just say we're learning from our experiences as instructors. And, there are additional things besides familiarity with critical race theory or linguistic theory that are going to be wrapped up in this whole agenda. Racism and other oppressive ideologies, they cause harm, and the resulting traumas are really deep and historical and at times very present for students and instructors. And I'll wrap up in just a moment here so we have time for discussion. But I think if we want to surface those ideologies, part of the ongoing professional development is going to be getting familiar and practiced with trauma-informed teaching and expectations around harm and reconciliation or repair when that's part of the work. Okay, so let's wrap it up for the moment. We'll have a few minutes to chat if we'd like to. I think for future directions, I just want to go back to some of the voices that I shared at the beginning of the talk. The theory and the research is there, but like the point as language educators is really taking seriously and believing folks who are expressing harm in the spaces where we're working. I can say for myself that during research training, I think a lot of the preparation was being accountable to the theories I was working with or the teachers I was working with or the teacher that I was. But I also would just, hear expressions like Alberta's from the beginning of the talk and just was reminded always to ask myself accountability to whom and to what. And so I'll just bring back the words of some of the folks from the beginning of the talk. I think the poet, if we listen to him again, he envisions these futures that he talks about in terms like pursuing shared flourishing and imagining otherwise. And our friend Dr. Meisel talks about futures of validation and the presence of community knowledges in curriculum. And if we listen to the children themselves, like Alberta or Dylan, they want belonging, they want recognition, they want belief. And these things are entangled with language instruction. They want curriculum and instruction and assessment, the whole package that preserves, I think, their sense of freedom to be and to dream. This reminds me, all children come from the country of dreaming, right? And I think, I briefly introduced you to an expert in his field, a lawyer, a judge, who said challenging ideologies head on damages self-respect and diminishes humanity. And so let's keep futures on deck where we imagine and create them so we can live there. We know this work is constrained right now. Your constraints may be different than mine, but there are challenges to doing it. And yet I do think there's opportunities to meaningfully collect around it. And so I'll just leave a couple of possible additional reads for you here, a couple of special issues where we've explored different aspects of anti-racist work in relation to genre approaches and some other ones. On the left here, you can see I think a great little picture of Dr. Meisel with Sally on Halliday's memorial bench talking about these issues, right? Or on the right, my friend and colleague Ron Darvid, and we've dived into the topic of texts and countertexts recently. So check those out. And then for anything else, please do reach out. I'm so happy we had a chance to spend some time today. A few minutes here for any questions or comments or experiences of what it's like in your place. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, for the insightful and thought-provoking plenary. We truly appreciate your contribution. We now have 5 minutes for questions and discussion. Please feel free to raise your hand or post your question in the chat. Yes, Jacqueline.
Hi. Hi, Kathryn. Hi, everybody. We have our TESOL program now set up so that everybody is taking 7-week courses to graduate as soon as possible. And the only 2 courses about language really are linguistics and grammar, both of which I teach. But I'm really struggling to get them to learn even simple things about English grammar, much less what they need to know about genre pedagogy and everything else. And now New York State is switching to the WIDA consortium, which is very good news, and good news for me because it's all based on SFL. But I'm still struggling where am I going to put this in the curriculum? How am I going to add this to courses? And my colleagues have never been receptive to anything with SFL because they don't know it themselves and don't understand what possible good it could do. So just any suggestions or support?
Yeah. Well, first, all the empathy in the world, right? It's like, this is one of the constrained contexts I think I was hinting at the end. I can say that one step that has been effective for all instructors, even if they're not sold themselves on SFL, that's another problem we have sort of as instructor buy-in to the language part. But one thing that's been small and powerful that I hope will eventually ripple into next steps after that is just drawing their attention to whose voices are here when they're teaching mentor texts, because that's at least in our program, and the language piece of things is so small and the program is so packed that it feels hard to know what can we add. Adding will be so much, but I will say some very productive conversations have started from just saying, and whose voice is here? For example, one group of students noticed that they're always teaching with children's encyclopedias to their multilingual learners, and just asking, whose perspective on agriculture are we getting here? And they're like, wait, what? Who's the authors of encyclopedias? Who's here? Is a good first step.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a question in the chat. So Margot is saying, thank you, Kathryn, for adding power and ideology to the equation, since it is indeed an undeniable part of reality. And no, critical discourse analysis does not mean adopting a negative approach. How could a framework based on SFL and culturally sustaining pedagogy be successfully applied to teaching international students in TESOL setting? I think applying this approach in an Australian context might be quite challenging. Great work.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I don't know if it's exactly the same, but I'll just share an experience I had moving from beginning this work in the US to coming to do it in a Canadian context, where like the degree of multiculturalism looks similar if you just look at the numbers, but the cultural landscapes are really different. And so a conversation that's really active here, and I don't know if this resonates with what you're experiencing, is that families who are immigrating to Vancouver are all of a sudden in the middle of really intense conversations about residential school history and the treatment of Indigenous peoples in this area. And so they're feeling like we need to sort of speedily get up with the cultural context, but also what's our relationship to reconciliation in this space. And I don't know if there's textures there of what you might be talking about in the chat. I actually think in some ways, the smallest first answer could be quite similar to what I just said to Jackie in her context, which is just starting to put a who to the voices in the classroom and slowly building that sense that there might be a pattern here or not. What's the pattern in your place for who's here? Who do we need to intentionally bring in as the sort of foundations for building these conversations? Should you ever be interested, I'd love to share with you all just in the experience of getting it wrong sometime too. And I see we just have a minute left in this session, but please do email me if you want to chat sometime about things we've tried and got wrong, trying to work towards your question as well. Yeah.
Thank you. We've got one last question from Lucy.
And I see Michael, your hand too. Thanks for being here. Lucy, go ahead.
Thank you. I love that. Continuing, I think, what you're saying about whose voice is here and the difficulty in choosing texts and maybe the guts to choose a counter text being part of the issue. I'm wondering whether the whose voice is here and looking at engagement as something that you could build into any text, a bit of language knowledge around that could go a long way. Thoughts?
Oh, that's wonderful. We hadn't, we've experienced a little bit of what Jackie might be describing with just trying to get the littlest tiptoe in that I don't think we've played with transitivity a bit in terms of, you know, can we look at the text for who's here and who are they bringing into the text, like that layer of it. But I actually think engagement could be a really
Yeah,
productive one to go in at.
and it might not require that much sort of technicality, that much meta language, you know, opening space and closing down space. You could do that with any text.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You know, one other challenge that we saw right away from teachers in our context was just that time pressure. Like, even if I'm committed to seeking out diverse racialized perspectives on my curriculum topics, like the time to find, to evaluate all that stuff was really challenging. So one side project we've got started, I'll put the link in the chat, and it's just in its first stages, but we started to kind of curate a collection of counter texts and try to make connections to local curriculum topics just to speed along that first step. But one thing that we did was reached out to every single author we featured here to say, like, how do you want to be? How do you self-identify? When you say who you are coming into this topic, who are you? So that teachers have something like reliable to work with to shorten at least that distance to getting counter text into the classroom. So check it out. It's in a very beta piloty version, but you know, there might be some inspirations there too. I love this idea of engagement though. I'll explore. Thank you. And Michael, I saw your hand as well. Are you still here?
I'm still here, but I don't know if we have time. So
I think we're a bit flexible because we have a break after this. So 1 more minute. Please go ahead, Michael.
sure, thanks. Thanks for the talk, Kathryn. In your section on assessment, you said that one way to implement CRT approaches to this is to build in more flexibility for remixing. And I'm kind of curious if there are any boundaries around that at all. Is it anything goes? So, for example, I know a colleague that teaches an English composition course who got a paper from a student written in Mandarin. How would an anti-racist approach like assess such a paper? And is the position, it kind of seems like the CRT position is that students ought to be able to express in any given school assignment, express any idea for any purpose in any context and in any genre and any register. And that the teacher should be therefore fluent and be able to assess in all possible languages and registers. Otherwise, the teacher is engaging in some kind of racism. I'm kind of curious where the boundaries are, if there are any.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And also I'd love to continue this conversation at great length, but I'll give the 1 minute answer now. No, it's not boundaryless, but the priorities shift a little bit. So one of the first challenges in Remix is like we show students examples of the kinds of things we want to see, and then we help them see the dimensions of that. Part of the work that's unknown right now is pushing towards new genres. And so the question that the center is, what does it look like? And we explore this together with students. What does it look like?
على التسجيل فبس ظل اقدمها وادير الاسئله اللي عندي السؤال.
Just hearing a little feedback from another participant, but the question is, what does it look like to show knowledge about this topic? And then together with students, there's some sort of negotiation of what that's going to look like. And that part should feel familiar within genre pedagogy. How can we play with a new form for sharing knowledge on this curriculum topic? Where are we drawing from to bring together purposes in this kind of text? And how are our choices landing? And so those questions are still at play, but it's in that analytical thinking that the assessment happens more than the sort of correct production of a known genre already. And that's very exploratory terrain. So that's why I would love to kind of have that conversation at length more later. But I want to preserve some tea time for folks. Please do email me. I'll put my email in the chat in case you missed it earlier.
Well, thank you so much, Kathryn, for that insightful and thought-provoking plenary. We truly appreciate your contribution to the conference. Let us all join in giving her a big virtual round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care and talk more soon.
Thank you so much, Karen, for your wonderful speech. Thanks so much, everyone. It was a wonderful morning. So now, please grab, enjoy your morning tea, and then we will be back at 10:45 for parallel session. But I'm going to open the true background room now, so you can join if you like. Okay.